Shalom guys, it's Joel Sanchez with Crucified Life Ministries here with you today, and we're looking at the portion Vayeshev, and it can be found in Genesis chapter 37 beginning in verse 1 to chapter 40 verse 23. So let's begin. We have a little bit to talk about here. We see an important concept all throughout this parsha. And that concept is dealing with honor and shame. We can see it in the life of Joseph. We can see it in the story of Tamar. So let's begin. We see here in the story of Joseph, he has his dreams, and his dreams is basically telling him that he's going to be the man. People are going to be bowing down to him, submitting to him, and he's going to be the man. Well, if you remember, Joseph was actually at this time the youngest of all of his brothers. And he even had like some brothers who were grown men, okay, like Reuben, when Joseph was like 17 years old. So just imagine a 17-year-old sibling telling a grown man, his older brother, that, hey buddy, you're going to be bowing down to me one day. And mom and pops, same thing's going to happen too. It didn't go over very well. But we also see in this story that his brothers despised him because of that. They also despised him because Jacob was very fond of Joseph. Joseph was kind of the pick of the litter, if you will. And also we see that Joseph had a coat, some versions say of many colors, but actually the Hebrew there points us to a coat that was actually long. Now, why is that important? What does it matter if it was a coat of many colors or a long coat? Well, in the ancient Near East, many people's identity was in the clothes that they wore. So if you had a coat that was very long, it meant your status within the family. Usually the firstborn actually had the best and the longest coat out of all of the rest of the brothers. Why? Because he was the firstborn and the inheritance would go to him. So isn't it interesting that Jacob decides to give Joseph the longer coat when he was a teenager, when he even had a lot of older brothers? Now can you see why the older brothers despised him and why they treated him the way they did? And even in the story, before they threw him in the pit and everything, they stripped him of his coat. This is very significant in the ancient Near East, because when someone was stripped of their coat, it was a sign of shame and dishonor. What do I mean by that? Well, in Genesis, we can back all the way up to Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. In the story of Adam and Eve. Let's go back and let's read that really quick. So in this story, it says, and the eyes of both of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. So interesting that for the first time they see themselves as naked and they sew fig leaves together. And it goes on to say, and they heard the voice of Elohim walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Elohim amongst the trees of the garden. Now, why would they do a thing like that? Well, it goes back to the concept of honor and shame. Because, see, your honor and shame was also a part of your clothing, as I mentioned before. So when they lose, or I guess we could say lose, but when they realize that they're naked, that means they're no longer covered with something. Their clothing, or whatever they had before, had been removed. So therefore, immediately they get fig leaves and they sew them together to cover themselves again, to cover their dishonor and their shame. So this is a great example. Many people say that this is about, later on we see Yahweh covering them with the skin of an animal, but or covering them with clothing, with skin. And many people take that and says, well, see, here's sacrifices. Yahweh has to sacrifice something in order to forgive them of sin. But I'm not totally in agreement with that. It actually teaches us about adoption. Because what it's saying is they caused shame, they were dishonorable, but then Yahweh comes back, gives them the consequences of their sin, what they're going to have to go through because of their sin. Okay? Then he says, hey, I'm going to adopt you guys back into my family. Thus, I'm going to cover you with my clothes. So do you see how important this concept is here of clothing? Okay, and so you actually see right in the beginning in Genesis chapter 3, you can even go back to Genesis chapter 1 and see the gospel, but right here in Genesis chapter 3 we see the gospel. There's nothing new in the New Testament. The gospel has been from the beginning of time, and it will go through until the end of time. There's nothing new. So in the beginning, we have children of Yahweh doing something dishonorable and shameful, sinning, and we see Yahweh coming in, and we see them breaking covenant, and we see Yahweh coming in, and we see Him take clothing and clothing them again, and saying, come back in to my family. Be a part of my family again. Isn't that what the parable of the prodigal son is all about? Remember, the son goes to a foreign country. He says, give me all of my inheritance. I want to go to a foreign country. He squanders his inheritance. He's eating food with the pigs. And he goes, man, I got to get back home because at least even a servant or a slave in my father's house has it better than I have it. So he goes back home, and the first thing the father does when he sees him, the father runs to him, he kisses him, and the father calls for a robe to be placed, one of the best robes, to be placed back on his son. Meaning, even though you've broken covenant, you left my house, you have repented, you have returned, and now I'm going to place my authority and my covering. I'm going to adopt you again as my son. That's the gospel, people. That's the God we serve. That's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm so thankful that He's my king and I'm a part of His kingdom. And He allowed me to be a part of His kingdom. And He adopted me and brought me into His kingdom. So let's get back to the story of Joseph. So we see the brothers take the coat off of him because in those times, in the ancient Near East, the coat meant that it meant your social status. It was who you were, basically. Kind of like today when people wear Prada or Gucci or I'm not up on all the fashion clothing, but whatever your top of the line clothings are, people go, oh wow, that guy must have money. He must have some clout. He must be somebody because of the clothes he's wearing. It was the same way back in the ancient Near East. But even more importantly, that robe, that tunic was very important because inside of that robe there was a pouch sewn in there called the hem of the garment. Does that sound familiar? And that hem of the garment, it had your most important documents in there, as if like land deeds or titles to lands, properties, things like that, and even covenants that you made with other people. That's where this document would be kept at. And even in the women, this document, this is actually not document, but this hem of the garment, this pouch, this this little pouch there on the inside of the tunic, of the robe, the dowry would be placed there. And the woman would keep that dowry there in case her husband divorced her unjustly, or in case she would widowed, because it would help her sustain her for a rainy day. Now, interesting about this tunic or this robe, and getting back to the shame aspect of it, we see in Torah and in other places, in other ancient Near East documents, that if a woman would commit adultery, then she would be brought to the town square or the public square in front of everyone, and the husband would strip her. He would remove her robe, her clothes, to actually bring shame upon her, to cause shame and dishonor on her, because she committed adultery and shamed and dishonored her husband's name. And the dowry, her, I really shouldn't say inheritance, but the dowry would actually, when the husband would strip that, the dowry would go to the husband, and the lady would have to leave naked and shamed. Very interesting concept. So when the brothers stripped Joseph of his tunic, of his robe, they weren't just taking it off to use it, to send back to Dad and put some blood on it, even though they put blood on it and sent it back to Jacob and said, hey, look, Dad, Joseph's dead. Here's the proof. No, they were saying, hey, buddy, you said you were going to be the man, but we'll show you who are the men here. And they removed this tunic from him to cause shame and bring dishonor to him. And then they threw him in a pit. Well, you know the rest of the story. I mean, it goes on. He's sold into slavery. He goes into Egypt. He even goes into Potter's house. Then he has another problem with a robe. He has a lady. He's trying to be righteous. He even tells her, I can't lay with you because it would be a sin against my God. And so what does she do? She grabs his robe, and he turns and he runs out. He leaves, and she removes his robe from him. And so it brings shame to Potiphar's house, and Joseph is thrown into prison because of this, because of another issue with the removal of a robe and dishonor and shame. Okay? And so you know the rest of the story. He interprets the dreams and all of that. But I want to finish up with something very interesting, because in the middle of this story of Joseph, we actually find a story about Judah and Tamar. And it almost seems very out of place. And something as I was reading this portion, before we get started with that, speaking of Judah and talking about the removal of the robe, it's almost as if Joseph, being a type and shadow of Ephraim, the house of Israel, if you will, and Judah being a type of the house of Judah, it's almost as if that same spirit is going on today. And Judah has removed, or tries to remove, the coat that Yahweh has put on Ephraim, or those who would not pertain or be of the house of Judah. And it's almost as if we're looked down upon as second-class citizens, or second-rate people. And therefore, it's very prophetic that in the story of Joseph, Judah removes Joseph's coat. And we still see Judah today not wanting to accept Joseph or Ephraim. So therefore, it's almost as a dishonorable thing, as they look down upon us, trying to shame us and say, oh, you guys are goyim, you guys are Gentiles, you have to convert to become a Jew to get up to our level. So I just kind of threw that in there because I found that interesting. This is the first time I've seen that in reading this week's parsha. But the story of Judah and Tamar is very interesting because it's honor and shame all in it as well. And what it entails is we see that Judah had two sons, and Yahweh takes the first son because he was very wicked. So Tamar is left as a widow, so therefore Judah gives her the second son, or the next son in line, to raise up a son to carry on Judah's first son's name, and so that the inheritance would be able to be passed along. Well, we see the second son didn't fulfill what he was supposed to do, his requirements. He spilled his seed on the ground. So therefore Yahweh takes him, and then Judah says, I'm going to give you Shiloh. Well, we read on in the story that the time came and was gone. And Tamar saw that Judah was not going to fulfill his promise and fulfill his Torah mandate in giving her a kinsman redeemer, if you will. Just like in the story of Ruth, we see this very clear. So Judah didn't give her Shiloh, and therefore what happens? Well, Tamar has to take matters into her own hands. She goes and she dresses up like a temple prostitute, and one day Judah's coming into town there and he sees her and he wants to lie with her. So he lies with her. Well, when he does, she actually gets pregnant. And Judah says, what do you want? And he doesn't know at this time that she's pregnant. And so she basically says, he says, I'll give you a goat. She says, well, what will you give me so that I'll know that you're going to go through with your promise? Well, Judah didn't know it was Tamar. So anyway, he gives her his seal, his cord, and his cane, or his, what does Genesis chapter 38 call it? Let me get it right here. Cane is the Spanish word for it. Let's see here. Okay, here we go in verse 18. So he gives her a signet, a bracelet, and a staff. That's the word, staff. And these all mean authority. It has to do with who Judah is. So he gives these to her while he can go back, get the goat, and bring the goat back to her. Well, by the time he sends the guy back with the goat, he goes, hey, we don't know who this temple prostitute is. Nobody in the town knows who she is, and she's gone. So therefore, Judah doesn't know. Well, a few months later, word gets back to Judah that Tamar is pregnant. And he says, she's gone whoring. Bring her here and let me burn her. Which is very interesting because Torah talks about, most of the time you can stone adulteresses. But in another case, Judah goes, let me burn her. We need to burn her. And this was used if a priest's daughter was caught in adultery. So I just thought I'd throw that tidbit in there. She possibly could have been a priest's daughter. I don't know. I haven't studied that out. Maybe some of you can comment on that and answer that for me. But I just thought that was very interesting that Judah says burn her, and then there is an instruction in Torah that a priest's daughter that's caught in adultery, she can be burned to death. So anyway, Judah brings her, and she reveals something very interesting. And she goes, I'm pregnant by the guy who owns these. And she pulls out the signet, the staff, and the seal. And Judah goes, uh-oh, you have actually been more righteous than I was. So she took a shameful situation and turned it around to bring honor to her name. And Judah because he didn't fulfill what Torah said, he kind of got showed up by a woman, and thus he had to admit, you acted more righteous than I did. So do you see how important the concept of honor and shame is in studying the Torah? And that a lot of people go, oh, well, Tamar, she acted like a prostitute. She acted like a whore. She slept with Judah. There were ulterior motives that she did that. And something that would be frowned upon in our culture and society today was actually looked at as a righteous act or a righteous deed that she did because of someone else's unrighteousness and not fulfilling what the Scripture says. So until next time, hopefully you can see the importance of this honor and shame concept when you read your Scripture. And we need to apply this to our lives because we're either bringing honor or shame to the Creator of the universe and to even our names today if by the way we live our lives and by the way we treat other people. So until next time, I'm Joel Sanchez with Crucified Life Ministries. Shalom.